Welcome, everybody. I'm very excited to have this International Society for the Science Religion session on the categories of science religion. So one of the most distinctive moves and developments in the field of science religion in recent decades, especially encouraged by Peter Harrison's Gifford Lectures published as the Territories of Science Religion, is the recognition that science and religion are not natural categories. These terms emerged in the modern period and often, arguably, carry questionable philosophical assumptions. But the question that emerges is what comes next? Should scholars abandon these terms, and indeed maybe even the field of science religion, and replace it with something else? Or can one use terms like science and religion responsibly without committing the philosophical sin of essentialism? So we've assembled a great team of historians, theologians, social scientists working in the area of science religion to address this ongoing debate. So our panelists, I'm going to introduce them in the order of speaking. First is Peter Harrison, Emeritus Professor of History and Philosophy at the University of Queensland and professorial research fellow at the University of Notre Dame in Australia. Next is Lisa Sedaris, Professor of Environmental Studies at UC Santa Barbara. Next is Gijsbert van der Brink, Chair of Theology and Science at the Vrije Universiteit at Amsterdam. Then next we have a combo presentation. Anthony Narn, who's a PhD candidate at York University, will give a paper with Fraser Watts, who can't be here, who is former reader of Theology and Science at Cambridge, and now the Executive Secretary of the ISSR. And then our final panelist is Dr. Joanna Leidenhag, Associate Professor of Theology and Philosophy at the University of Leeds. And so our way we'll set this up, each panelist will have 8 to 10 minutes to kind of give a presentation, and then we'll look forward to a discussion afterwards.
Let me get straight into it, and I should just say at the outset, I think we need to preserve these terms. We can't do without them. And I don't think a historical critical account of the terms is going to spell the demise of the field of science and religion. Mark Harris helpfully pointed out to me yesterday just how many times I used the word science in the last time I was up at the podium. So I'm really kind of forced into this position. We just can't do away with these categories. Or just use of the terms. Now, that said, I do think it makes a difference to how we think about the field and to how we understand projects within it. And what I want to do today is just talk about 3 areas where I think we have to deploy these concepts very carefully and critically. And these are relatively straightforward, I think, and for some of you, this will be quite familiar. But the first point I want to make is that we need to deploy them critically when we're understanding the past. So the history of science, the history of religion, and the history of their relationships. If we take the case of science, that's for you, Mark, inverted commas around the science in this case. We now know that the relevant actors before the 19th century did not imagine themselves to be conducting science as we understand it. Here, the linguistic markers are key, and the key figures in the scientific revolution, for example, understand themselves as engaging in practices like natural philosophy, natural history, mixed mathematics. Newton, for example, considered himself to be a natural philosopher conducting natural philosophy, not a scientist engaged in physics. In the 19th century, however, natural philosophy was shoehorned into the category of physics. Natural history became biology, and these were comprehended into a single kind of enterprise, what we now call science, an aggregation of these once disparate activities. Along with this, we get the notion of a scientist and a scientific method, which are, again, novelties of the 19th century. Now, this is not just a fussy point about historical labels. It's not just a semantic issue, because natural philosophy is not coextensive with physics. Natural history is not coextensive with biology. So a relevant difference, for example, would be that the subject matter of natural philosophy traditionally encompassed God and the angels, and this is hardly true of modern physics. So what the relevant history shows is that the construction of the modern category science in the 19th century involved the aggregation of a number of different disciplines, including the historical sciences of biology and geology. And it involved the exclusion of God talk. And for some, indeed, the legitimacy of science as a modern enterprise rested precisely on its exclusion of religious considerations, its embrace of naturalistic principles, its moving beyond religion, and indeed, for some, its opposition to religion. In short, it's bad history to use the category science for these sorts of activities. But to move to a further development of this point, there are clear implications for our present practices as well. Once we understand science to involve a somewhat artificial aggregate of diverse activities with different objects of study and different methods, the most obvious of these, I mean, evolution is a historical science, largely physics and mathematical science. This will limit our capacity to make generalizations about relations between science and religion, and to some extent it will make it difficult to deploy typologies of such general relations. Now, I think that this insight has already been implicated in science-engaged theology, which takes seriously the diversity of activities that fly under the banner of science. And I can't state this more clearly than John Perry and Joanna in their account of science-engaged theology. And I just quote, "As long as we are asking questions about something called science and how it relates to something called religion, we're setting the stage for misunderstandings, misconceptions, and myths." And if you're interested in further implications, if you look at their practical rules of thumb for what follows from this, they've set these out very nicely in the Cambridge Elements book on science-engaged theology. Now, it's also the case that social scientific research should and has been informed by historical understanding of the nature of these categories. So Nick Spencer and Hannah White from the Theos Foundation in the UK produced a report entitled Science and Religion, Moving Away from the Shallow End. The shallow end is like the swimming pool where all the noise is, right? All the kids play. But what they found was that in sociological studies, if you ask people about their views of religion and science, they lean towards incompatible. If you ask them about religion and a specific science, they're far more inclined to see compatibility. And if you ask about a specific science and a specific religious tradition, once again, you get a very different kind of response to the straightforward notion of conflict. So what this suggests is that common popular understandings, one that place science and religion in an antagonistic relation, tend to dissolve a little bit, at least, once we have a more nuanced understanding of how these categories function to aggregate what are, in fact, quite disparate activities. Now, most of the examples thus far have involved science, and I want to move, my second point is to say something about the category religion, because I don't think there's a perfect symmetry in the implications for religion and for science. And one difference, I think, is that we encounter what I would call internal critique of the notion religion. And this contrasts with the case of science, where I think the critique was largely initiated by outsiders, primarily historians of science, not by scientists themselves, rather historians wanting to counter the Whiggish histories of science that scientists would tend to construct for themselves. But the case with religion is a little bit different. The locus classicus for internal critique is paragraph 17 of Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics, where Karl Barth declares that revelation brings about the abolition of religion. Now, abolition may not be the best translation. For the Hegelians out there, the term is Aufheben, so it's to some extent an abolition and overcoming. But at any rate, let's run with abolition for the moment. So for Barth, human religion is unbelief. It contrasts with revelation. Christianity is not a religion in this sense, but a response to God's self-revelation. Now, we also get this critique of religion in Bonhoeffer's notion of religionless Christianity, and we get similar resistance in other traditions to the notion that religion depicts what they imagine themselves to be involved in their activities. Now, this general point was reinforced by the Canadian scholar Wilfred Cantwell Smith, and this is well known in religious studies, in The Classic Meaning and End of Religion, which is a kind of foundational critique of the concept from the perspective of religious studies, or I think more strictly comparative religion as it was in those days. So Cantwell-Smith points out that not only did the pre-modern West not have the category religion, but neither did non-Western traditions either, or in Islam was a special case. But anyway, Cantwell-Smith was a comparative religionist and an Islamic scholar. My sense is that he was nonetheless motivated by a question that arose in the context of the theology of religions, which was also to some extent Barth's concern. And what I mean by that is that his insights were addressed to the question of the problem of religious pluralism, the competing truth claims of the so-called world religions. And the argument, I think, was essentially that that problem could be ameliorated to some degree if we took a critical approach to the notion that these things, in fact, were religions constituted by sets of beliefs and practices. So the situation is a little bit different to the category science. It was not the case that scientists were uncomfortable with the category science and regarded it as distorting what they were about. On the contrary, I think. But this suggests that religious communities may have good reasons to be more resistant to the application of the category to their own activities than scientists do to theirs. One thrust of the critique of the concept of religion directly relevant to science and religion is that the problem of conflicting truth claims of the so-called world religions is at least to some extent a function of the category itself, and that the apparent tension between religions can be ameliorated to some degree by relinquishing the category and thinking in terms of alternatives such as faith. That was Cantwell-Smith's point, and I'm increasingly thinking he was right about that. Mutatis mutandis, we can also think analogously that some of the apparent conflicts between science and religion arise because we persist in using these categories to describe the relevant practices. And if we thought about these activities more in terms of, say, the communal nature of knowledge production in both the role played by trust, the importance of specific practices and so on, we'd be less inclined to default to some kind of conflict mode. Right. Again, much more could be said about that, but let me move to the third point. I want to finish by identifying one final area where I think persisting with the categories is problematic. These categories not only distort what they purport to describe when we apply them to our own past, but the same is true for their application to other cultures, which, if the history of the contingent emergence of these categories in the West is true, are unlikely to have direct equivalence to these notions, there not being universal natural kinds. It follows that well-motivated attempts to extend the science and religion field to traditions other than Christianity need to resist the temptation to project onto them our own contingent categories. This, of course, is complicated by the putative universality of science in this context, which is, again, over against the historical particularity of the various traditions. So I think this also has clear implications for the status of indigenous religions, or more relevantly, for what is an increasingly, a category that's increasingly used, indigenous science. I think aspiration to lend scientific status to indigenous knowledges might be well intended, but I wonder if there are better ways to elevate their status and give them their proper due. The move to talk about indigenous science seems to me to buy into the reification of science, to view it in an essentialist fashion, ignore the contingent circumstances that gave rise to it, reinforce its elevated epistemic status, and perhaps give tacit support to the hierarchical stadial schemes of history that spoke in terms of the development away from primitive religion and magic to something like science. Now, none of this is to endorse the condescension that we see in the Richard Dawkinses and Lawrence Krauses of the world, who quite predictably have weighed into recent discussions of the status of indigenous science. It's rather a matter of placing modern science, rather a matter of placing modern science alongside other knowledge systems and frankly acknowledging the differences. And this might allow for a chastening of aspects of modern science along with an acknowledgement of the value of what other traditions have to offer. But in this exercise, I think the categories of science and religion tend to get in the way. In sum then, a critical approach to these categories doesn't spell the end of our discipline or our subfield, but rather expands the field, I think. It makes it potentially more interesting and fruitful. It rectifies our historical understanding of the past, helps us understand and see the plurality of practices that that operate under these respective categories, and it gives us insights into the persistence of conflict narratives and helps us understand other cultural traditions with sensitivity.
I think someone first and foremost who works in the area of religion and nature, or I would say even environmental ethics, and kind of secondarily a scholar of science and religion. So I think I can only cast a kind of partial or a particular light on the questions that we're being asked to discuss here today. So I want to offer some reflections on how debates about the categories of science and religion intersect with my area of research, just sort of religion and nature, environmental ethics, with a couple of examples in mind of the use of genetic technologies to restore the natural world. So I'm going to recap some of what Peter just said. So I'm drawing on his work, so I'm just going to recap a few things that you just heard a moment ago. So there's recently been a reconsideration of the term science and religion, brought about in part by Peter Harrison's work. As he argues, our modern terms, science, I'm going to do this too, science and scientific emerged relatively recently in conjunction with a boundary establishing move that placed religion, ethics, and metaphysics into a category of not science. So excluded from the category of professional scientists in the process by which science became a profession, then we're not only amateurs, including, of course, many women, but also clerics, people like that, people who might have been considered to be doing sort of, I don't know, natural history or natural philosophy. And thus the category of science was never neutral, but performed hidden work and still does perform hidden work. Science and religion are historically contingent categories, and the details of their historical development has led to a situation in which both terms have become associated with propositional beliefs. So this association creates other downstream effects, which include often setting up science and religion for a conflictual relationship. And the propositional framework may also place the onus on religion, or perhaps theology, to contort itself to fit the superior truths of science. The result being there's often not so much a dialogue between the two as a kind of monopolizing of the conversation by the more dominant partner, i.e. science. So I'm sympathetic to the move to go beyond propositional beliefs, in part because some of my own work, or not so recent work, has been critical of a particular type of science-religion engagement in which the move is to sort of create a science-based myth of the universe that is meant to sort of replace or outcompete the existing world religions, which then kind of boils religions down to the idea that their essence really lies in creation stories. And so, in other words, religions are seen in this way of thinking about creation stories as almost like a proto-science, something that's attempting to do science, but doing it badly, that is, explaining the world. So I think only in a world where we assumed that science and religion offer these kind of propositional statements about the world, could you launch a project like that? So in any case, the question of whether we ought to abandon the terms science and religion is more complicated. As Josh Reeves has argued, one can be skeptical that science and religion name natural kinds in the world without jettisoning the terms altogether. There are options in between, and religion scholars have modeled some similar approaches, seen in the turn to practices, affects, imaginaries, rather than simply belief as the relevant category, the latter of which seems a sort of Protestant hangover. For his own part, Harrison has proposed about thinking about science and religion in terms of formative practices, which I find very useful. And so I want to kind of extend that way of thinking to some questions that I've been looking at within sort of environmental ethics or religion and nature. So Harrison argues, quote, that the putative objectivity of the natural sciences has masked the fact that scientific training involves a formative process designed to focus attention on certain features of reality at the expense of others, and sort of preparing one to access certain types of relevant knowledge. The same thing then can happen in religion, although knowledge, we're using this term very loosely. Right, so scientific training involves a process of habituation, which can turn a heuristic, which might be legitimate in its own realm, into an all-encompassing view of the world, and sometimes in very reductivist ways. So this shift to formative practices seems to track some approaches in religious studies as well. The formative practices perspective seems useful for understanding some phenomena in environmental ethics that have piqued my interest. So I'm drawing on some work that I've done recently here. So I want to look at a couple of cases, one drawing from the work of so-called, I think, misleadingly named de-extinctionists. That is, people who want to, scientists who are trying to bring back extinct organisms through cutting-edge genetic technologies on the one hand, and looking at scientists who are working to save corals on the brink of extinction due to acidic and warming oceans. So across both of these groups, scientists are engaged with essentially the same toolbox, more or less: genetic editing techniques, assisted evolution, CRISPR kinds of techniques. And yet, in terms of their formation, if we want to think of it that way, they seem to inhabit very different worlds. I would call them sort of religious worlds or religious imaginaries. And they exhibit very different kinds of commitments, which I would call, I think, metaphysical commitments. So I'm going to make some sweeping generalizations here about, of course, not every coral scientist thinks one way and every de-extinctionist thinks another way, but there are some interesting comparisons when you compare these two groups who are doing, using the same tools, but they're thinking very differently about what they're doing. So if a commitment to naturalism and the formation and habituation that naturalism fosters leads de-extinction scientists to focus on certain features of reality at the expense of others, what features are they missing? I find that such researchers show a striking disregard for ecological and social contexts, for key forms of relationality that actually shape organisms and the species into what they are. So organisms in this imaginary are machines. You've heard this kind of model before. This is not exactly new and might sound like a straw man, but it's not a straw man. You'd be surprised that it's alive and well, actually. So genes are deployed here. So let me just back up a little bit. De-extinctionists see them as machines comprised of parts to be interchanged, omitted, or enhanced. Genes are deployed as usefully selfish units of matter. In fact, it's one of the few, maybe the last places in biology that I'm aware of where people still use the term selfish genes, which I thought was something we had actually gotten past. Selfish units of matter, and this is especially true in gene drive technologies, if you're familiar with any of those. They can be programmed at the engineer's bidding, including with the goal of excising unwanted parts of a genome or an ecosystem altogether, a project that may culminate in programmed extinction, which is something scientists are experimenting with mosquitoes in particular. So, for example, the geneticist George Church describes what I would say are sort of magical encounters with machine-like entities, drawing from an early fascination, a lifelong fascination going back to his childhood with computer technologies before the advent of, widespread advent of computers. And a penchant for seeing life as sort of bits of information to be decoded, rewritten, and repurposed. So we might say that the formative dynamics that shape the scientist's thinking are a case of expanding a heuristic, naturalism, in this case a very reductive one, into a full-blown worldview. Call it a metaphysics, according to which life consists of machine-like bits of data and the human relates to other life forms as an engineer. I think there's also a kind of secular-ish theological anthropology going on here, where the human relates to nature as a kind of world-making entity. So the gene-centered worldview that I've just described is a classic example of a thoroughgoing disenchantment, most people would say, refusal of any notion of life as animate, organismal, communal, relational, vital. And yet there's also at work here a deep enchantment with machines, with organic life as units of information, with coding. Scientists engaged in this work find meaning and purpose. I mean, they might say the universe is meaningless, but that's a proclamation about meaning, right? So meaningless, they find meaning and purpose, not so much in the idea of repairing ecological damage, which is a worthy motive, but in wielding a kind of power, the power of resurrection, that these genetic technologies afford. And so one thing I'm trying to say here is, where does the science end and the sort of religion begin? The science and the religion. But I also think this gets us into questions about secularization and whether secularization means disenchantment, which I think that this kind of example shows it does not mean the same thing, right? And I know this is more of what your latest book is about, which I have not read yet. Okay, so compare this approach to scientists who engage with similar technologies, gene editing, CRISPR, engineering, assisted evolution, to restore coral reefs. So I'm drawing on ethnographic work, not my own, Iris Braverman, who wrote a book called Coral Whisperers, which made a big impact on me. So while the toolbox is roughly the same, something quite different seems to have occurred in the formation, the habituation of these scientists, interestingly, a large number of whom are women. So corals are not individuals, as you might know, but rather a complex consortium of organisms living together. As assemblages with their algae symbionts, corals inspire appreciation of how seemingly discrete entities are in fact deeply entangled with and even constitutive of other living beings. Various coral-induced epiphanies have reconfigured the landscape of the biological sciences, lending support to a rhizomatic perspective that encourages non-hierarchical and non-binary categories and modes of thinking. This symbiotic view of life is often opposed to the gene-centered neo-Darwinian framework that reifies individuals and promotes competition and evolution as a sort of zero-sum game, which is quite rampant among the de-extinctionists that I've studied in terms of how they think about, genes. Corals, on the other hand, are central to the recent scientific realization that, quote, we have never been individuals and that we are all holobionts. Massive coral reefs inspire the hopeful idea that many laborers working together can create something grand and long-lasting, as reefs are thought to expand by sustaining others rather than displacing them. It's sort of a model for smart growth. This, too, clearly is an enchanted worldview, a metaphysics, perhaps, a religious imaginary, with the sacred coral symbiont as a symbol of relationality, mutuality, cooperative labor, etc. So again, the lines here between science and something like religion are very difficult to discern. And yet, when I say that these are religious-like values, I'm presuming the category of religion, right, in saying that. So we can't really get rid of them, but they begin to sort of blend together. So for all of their differences, these two ways of looking at the world can be helpfully understood through the lens of formative practices that Peter Harrison and others have suggested, that discipline the scientist to attend to certain facets of reality and thereby access certain types of knowledge. The researchers in each case here inhabit imaginaries and engage even perhaps in spiritual exercises that give meaning to the world and drive the scientist to take up particular projects as worthwhile. But what accounts for the fact that these scientists, presumably formed, I would guess, in similar naturalistic habits, approach non-human life in such radically different ways? How many different kinds of naturalisms are there, and how many metaphysics can go along with those different naturalisms? The cases that I've just discussed land us in the realm of applied rather than pure science. As Josh Reeves has noted, scientific experimentation and manipulation of nature are compatible with many different metaphysical schemes. But how do these different metaphysical schemes come to take hold of a scientist? As I've hinted, it seems likely that perhaps gender is one facet, that there are processes of formation that have to do with cultural norms and gender role formation. While both of these worldviews are imaginaries, that is the de-extinctionists and the coral scientists, these worldviews or imaginaries or practices or whatever you want to call them, while they both function in roughly religious ways, I think, one of them is frankly troubling and even unethical. That is the de-extinctionists. The other one, commendable, demonstrative of the kinds of values and commitments that we would want scientists to embrace. At least I would. So, in short, I would be interested to hear more discussion of how formative practices in the sciences can produce better scientists, better in the sense of being ethical and empathic, and in inculcating the ability to see humans as deeply connected to and even dependent on other creatures, as indeed we are.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Gijsbert van den Brink, and I would like to point out some new avenues beyond the fixed categories about the relationship between science and religion. A more extended and detailed version of this talk will be published by the Toronto Journal of Theology, and I think it will be published in spring of this year, 2025. So those of you who want to return to what I say or read the details, perhaps I can refer you to this upcoming article. Peter Harrison and his collaborators have definitely lent us a great service in disclosing the deeply contingent careers that the concepts of scientia and religio have made throughout Western history. I'm someone who was trained in an analytical tradition of philosophy and theology, so I was therefore predisposed to be fond of clear-cut abstract typologies. But the careful and detailed historical excavations of Peter Harrison and John Hadley Brooke and others, they have led me to be much more suspicious and critical of such easy generalizations in the field of science and religion. For example, to mention only the most famous one, the fourfold typology of someone like Ian Barber, which has been quoted and repeated and commented on time and again over the past decades. In particular, I've stopped using the concept of science to refer to pre-modern ways of studying nature, or even to standardized ways of investigating the natural world in non-Western cultures. So especially when it comes to historical considerations, the work of these historians of science has been of utmost importance to me. But how far does their discovery that science and religion are by no means natural kinds, how far does this discovery actually go? That is, what does it imply for users of the terms outside the historical domain, as in present-day contexts? My own experience is that thus far, the use of the terms, even in the very word combination science and religion, is almost unavoidable. For example, this session has been organized by the International Society of Science and Religion, and it's hard to see how this society could continue its work in a clear-cut way without using this kind of label. So apparently the formula science and religion still conveys to a wide audience what its core business is about. And even the habit to use inverted commas or quotation marks or scare quotes to go with the words or the phrase won't help, because these only raise the question what the quotation marks actually mean and ask for more clarification. In many other contexts as well, we can hardly escape using the formula, even in situations in which we are unable to immediately qualify them. So it seems to me that the various layers of meaning of the terms and their imprecision or vagueness may even be an asset here, since as a result the formula enables us to encapsulate what is actually a wide variety of practices and their various interrelations. So it may be precisely the vagueness of the terms which can sometimes be an advantage, and the various shades of meaning can actually be an asset as compared to very clear-cut definitions. One thing which I've learned in my systematic work as a theologian is to be more precise and specific in stipulating what I have in mind when I use terms like science and religion. So I try to break this vagueness or reduce the unspecificity and the generality of the terms by stipulating more concretely what science I have in mind and what religion or what sort of denomination I'm working on. And so here I'm in line with a recent suggestion by Andrew Davison, who has argued in a recent volume that as theologians we should be much more specific in our research by bringing to bear concrete scientific theories or developments on equally concrete and specific confessional or denominational traditions. In his case, he works mostly from the Thomistic tradition. And I myself wrote a monograph on Reformed theology and evolutionary theory. At the time that I published this book, it was very tempting to entitle it something like Christian Faith and Evolution or something like that, because the hunch was that that would warrant higher sales, such a more general title. But I decided to stick to the much more narrow word Reformed, referring to a Reformed tradition within Protestantism, since that was what I saw as my task in this book, to analyze the very specific doctrinal proclivities of what can be called the Reformed stance, and then to investigate how these interact with the main tenets of both the modern Darwinian synthesis and the extended evolutionary synthesis. So these are very concrete scientific theories as well, which I compare with very concrete denominational traditions. And I believe in order to move forward in the field, we need this sort of deep specificity. And perhaps in many cases, we have to be even more specific than referring to what is still a large tradition, what are still very encompassing theories like that of Darwinian evolution. Alistair McGrath has suggested the metaphor of a chessboard when it comes to the field of possible relationships between sciences and religions in the plural. And he argues that there is still a surprising amount of empty spots on this chessboard. That is, connections and interactions between concrete branches of religion or streams of thought and concrete sciences or scientific theories on the other hand that have hardly been researched. So, for example, we can be very grateful for Shoaib Malik for his book on Islam and evolution, which is actually also much more constrained in that he focuses on one Muslim tradition in particular, the Ash'ari tradition, and then compares that to evolutionary theory. And that kind of much more precise work is what we need in the near future, I would think. So this is one way to move forward, to become specific, delineating at all times what specific varieties of science and religion we have in mind when studying their interactions or even studying their isolation from each other. But surely there are other ways to move forward as well. For if there is one thing we can tell from the historical discovery of Harrison and the likes, then it is that just like the past, the future as well will probably display shifting and novel constellations of the fields of science and religion and changing meanings of the very terms. One such new constellation that is clearly emerging in our days, but which has thus far been understudied, is that in Western societies, science and religion may end up in the same boat. For both are increasingly seen as institutional endeavors, led by people from the elite that have to be treated with suspicion and distrust. There is a common trope for a long time already, I believe, that scientists have nowadays become the high priests of society, taking over the place of authority traditionally held by the church, by the clergy. But I think that this picture is almost obsolete by now, since it seems that we are quickly moving into different times in which not only religion, but also science is met with widespread societal criticism and distrust. And this already became clear during the COVID crisis, but a recent turn in American politics, in US politics, I should say, suggests that the notion of a post-truth society, which is anti-established traditions, both in science and religion, that this tendency may have staying power. Even when scientists come up with well-grounded results of their work, in many cases they just are no longer believed. And this also indicates that science may be facing social marginalization, just like religious institutions have experienced over the past couple of decades, if not centuries. It might mean that the days in which religion and theology have to stand a case over against science are disappearing or becoming less important, less prominent, since science no longer counts as the towering authority in society as it did until late modernity. But this is now changing rapidly, I would say, and one might even be inclined to say that, in a sense, science is secularizing these days, facing the same forces that churches have had to face for many decades already. So cuts in government spending, dropping enrollment numbers of students, etc., etc. That just looks like secularization. And this could actually engender an entirely new phase, I think, in the dialogue between practitioners of science and religion. Unlike people like Harrison and also Peter Harrison and Paul Tyson, I think the notion of dialogue is not at all obsolete in this connection. Both Harrison and Tyson have recently argued that the famous dialogue between sciences and religions has usually turned out to be one-way traffic, with theology and religion squarely at the receiving end, constantly accommodating themselves to new developments in science, and therefore they think that the metaphor of dialogue or the model of dialogue between science and religion is no longer very helpful. But I think that's not necessarily the case. I think it can be helpful. It can remain its usefulness. Ian Barber already demarcated the active roles that theology has to play in this dialogue. So not just at the receiving end, but he argued that in terms of methodological parallels, boundary questions, and studying the philosophical presuppositions of modern science, theology definitely has a say and an active role to play. And today a new role might be added to that. For today, scientists and religionists might engage in dialogue on how to address and how not to address the growing institutional distrust with which they both have to deal, and with which theologians are dealing for a longer time already than scientists. An important notion in such a dialogue will no doubt be the notion of truth, which obviously is crucial both for the sciences and for religions. Philosophers and social scientists are already doing a lot of work on notions like post-truth and science skepticism, etc., studying it in all sorts of ways. But as yet, I haven't seen much of work on it among scholars of science and religion. I think Josh Reeves may be one of the few who has done some great work in this area with his timely book entitled Redeeming Expertise of 3 years ago, I believe. So when sociologists of science and religion, like Elaine Eklund and a group from Rice University, like they recently asked a group of peers, what's next for us and our group to investigate? I would say that sociologists of science and religion as well might turn to exploring from an empirical angle how this new development, science having come to face similar counterforces as religion, actually takes shape, and how it is perceived among different groups. In my view, it would in any case be wrong-headed for theologians and religious people to simply rejoice over this downfall of modern scientific institutions. It may rather be their task to join scientists in finding ways to appropriately address contemporary science skepticism. For the truth about our world, in which science is deeply interested in the truth, I would say. It's the same truth that's crucial for religious believers as well, especially for those among them who consider God to be the source of all truth we can address or fathom.
I'm kind of coming at this from a bit of a cultural studies position. I work with Bernard Lightman, if anyone knows him, at York University. So in the humanities department at York, we're a bit of a mix. We're an eclectic mix, actually. And as most of you know, anyone studying the history and philosophy or whatever it may be of the sciences, and I'll use quotes just to follow the trend, because whatever science that may be, obviously it differentiates, and whatever religion that may be, whether it be a belief structure or a traditional Abrahamic religion, a spiritual practice, whatever, it becomes clear that the points of contact occur in all sorts of ways. John Hedley Brooke articulated this so clearly over 3 decades ago, that these moments are complex. It's kind of like a grounding principle, complexity. It changes with the context of their happening, there being the points of contact. And Peter Harrison followed this tradition, skillfully articulating the nature of this complexity by analyzing the history of the terms themselves, their changing value sets and meanings. Today, we being Fraser and I, comment on a particular engagement of this intersection in the last few decades, and that is science-derived grand narratives have come to serve for some, supported by sociological data, a religious function for growing numbers of people, in fact. However, we first argue that despite the complex relationship between science and the religious traditions, and often, as we're going to articulate, a fuzziness where it seems to eradicate those borders, there is a distinction, and that is important. We acknowledge that the sciences differ amongst themselves, just as religious and spiritual traditions differ amongst themselves, but that shouldn't lead us to the conclusion that there isn't a distinction between them. While there are indeed sufficient family resemblances, as some have articulated here, as Wittgenstein might have called it, those resemblances are not enough to make a conceptual, those resemblances are not enough to not make a conceptual distinction between them. We should stress that the terms science and religion are not interchangeable, and nor that they do not serve a useful purpose. Science and religion differ in many ways. They each belong to different aspects of our cultural life, which seems ever more so today. They occupy different physical spaces. They reach different subsections of the population. They are presented in different ways in different cultural texts. One simple, apparent differentiating factor is that science and religion tend to have different explicit objectives. Religion tends to be focused on transformation, salvation, say, the abstract aspects of meaning-making for life and, in some cases, post-life. Meanwhile, science primarily focuses on discovering how nature, aspects of and derived from it, work. Science has a rich repertoire of conceptually sophisticated activities that point to the out there. And it depends on the distinctive abstract conceptual intelligence of human beings, where spiritual and religious life is quintessentially a matter of the internal heart. The many spiritual practices involve techniques for sidelining conceptual cognition to give experiential cognition more scope. Such differences are never absolute, though, but each helps to contribute to the conceptual distinction between science and religion. However, as noted, things get fuzzy. I like these silly terms. In 1957, for example, Stephen Toulmin, examining cosmology from a cultural and philosophical lens, pointed out that much scientific thinking goes beyond what can be concluded from scientific evidence. Toulmin and others, like Mary Midgley, for example, argued that science has sufficiently developed enough abstract and removed from daily life knowledge to take the form of a myth, if one so wanted to. And indeed, Carl Sagan's famous line, "The cosmos is all there is, or ever was, or ever will be," speaks to this very claim. Others, like Lisa Sideris, for example, are skeptical of the consequences that may derive from this. We'll get to that momentarily. There are undoubtedly many gray areas, those fuzzy areas, phenomena that by some criteria look scientific and by others look religious or intersect on them both and become a sloppy mess. That's a terrible term, sorry. One example may be drawn here in, for example, the role of gender in its connection with sex. This example clearly reveals the grayness as it calls into question today's cultural climate and who lays epistemic claim on whether this is solely a matter to be decided by, say, the religious perspective, and the role of family, say, or the scientific perspective of, say, psychology or anatomy. And not to mention, this is a rich source of discourse. So there are many other fields all laying, that are all playing into this diversity of views. We want to make the case for looking at how science and religion operate more practically in the public domain. And we think that this is important. Outside the academy, science and religion and their relationship look different to the public. The concepts hold value, maybe more so than ever, outside of the academy. One way this importance can be understood is through looking at the importance of grand narratives in both science and religion in the public domain. There's paradoxically much suspicion about grand narratives in postmodern culture, notoriously proposed by Jean-François Lyotard. And yet, grand narratives are as vital today as they were at any point in the past, especially in both science and religious life. There's no prospect of human beings getting rid of narrative, even if we wanted to. Thomas Nagel argued that there's no view from nowhere. In a similar way, we claim that there is no way in which people can develop meanings and make sense of their circumstances without developing narratives that offer that view. Indeed, there is no understanding of human life, individual or cultural, without narrative. There's also the distinction between content and function. There are grand narratives that emanate from science, which in terms of content belong to the scientific world. We see from some early sociological and psychological studies that these have the capacity to do the job of religion for an increasing number of people in today's society, as shown by recent census data by both the UK and Canada. And in terms of function, they are, we claim, kind of religious. One example of this function is how science popularizers have used scientific knowledge from Big Bang to the present in a cohesive and seamless narrative style. As Toulmin and Midgley suggested, in presenting a scientific narrative as a coherent whole, such presentations, intentionally or not, can be seen as a modern secular creation narrative, and it takes on a mythic status. But it goes beyond this. It situates the human, teaches them an ethic of care for the environment, teaches them to respect the world, teaches them to respect the creatures of it. We argue that using religious narrative strategies, themes, and metaphoric symbolism, along with the visual and audible facsimiles to present secular understandings of life and cosmos, purposefully is a reoccupation of Abrahamic religions and their theologies, and other belief and spiritual practices more broadly, but here in secular material means. Reoccupation, if you may recall, is from Hans Blumenberg, and is a term for the reconstitution of metaphysical answer positions from one cultural stage in history to the next, from one set of meanings to another. In essence, religious symbolism and theological notions of compassion, oneness, togetherness, etc., can be transformed into secular facsimiles that, in popular secular presentations of science, are doing so as a means of spiritual rejuvenation or re-enchantment for those that can't find it from traditional religions or spiritual practices that have been typically defined. The mediums of popular culture, whether novels, movies, televisions, etc., utilize a grand cosmic narrative, realigning belief and substance transferred from the institutions of religion to the epistemic cultures of science. And while the reoccupation of, say, of Christianity is theology and or its meaning-making claims and practices, to science-based grand narratives seems like the erosion of science and religion as conceptual tools. It is the case that their use holds by being useful in making these claims to begin with. To differentiate between science and religion is to point to those aspects highlighted above that embody the different modes of being and different ways of engaging with the world. While we know we are contributing further to the fuzziness of these terms with something like the grand cosmic narrative, and recognize that these terms' meanings become questioned with examples such as this, we conclude that these terms give definition to this work and the work of others in this field when contextualized as complexity demands. Perhaps instead of thinking of should we be replacing them, we ought to be thinking of how are the meanings of these terms, how are people engaging with these concepts different, and what they tell us about today's sociocultural and economic climate.
That science and religion are not natural kinds, not essentialist categories, not culturally universal, is in and of itself no problem. As many people have pointed out, most of our concepts and words are kind of culturally specific and constructed. Words like European, white, feminine, middle-aged, theologian. Gosh, this is getting really personal. Immediately, this makes it clear to me that the categories that we're talking about, when we're thinking about what might come next or what it means to deconstruct them, an answer that we can rule out kind of from the get-go is that we can go out and find the real terms that we should be using. In several publications under the kind of heading of science-engaged theology, as Peter referenced earlier, I've argued that the terms science and religion need to be made more specific, like Gijsbert said, so that we can become more aware of the plurality and diversity of these kind of loose genuses. So when possible, we should speak of cognitive science or molecular biology. I actually think we could get even more specific than that, but Chinese medicine, rather than science writ large. We could, on the other side, we could also speak of British Methodism, Ash'ari Islamic theology, Californian Kabbalah. And when specificity isn't possible, because we do actually want to refer to all of that stuff at once, then we could at least speak in the plural, ugly as it might sound to our ears until we get used to it: the sciences, the religions, the world faiths, spiritualities, something like that. So my first point here is rather obvious, perhaps, but also important, that even these more specific terms, or using a plural term, also does not pick out a natural kind. And in fact, the benefit of specificity or plurality is that it foregrounds that, and we're less likely to make the mistake of being deceived that we're talking about something universal or generic that's always existed. Now, I did hear a little bit of laughter, and I did wonder whether someone might kind of think to themselves, oh, Chinese medicine, that doesn't get mentioned much in this context. Perhaps you even thought, I'm not really sure Californian Kabbalah should be on your list. So the second advantage of specificity is it leaves more open questions of legitimacy or authority, which are rather quickly closed down in our usual use of the words science and religion. Now, of course, questions of legitimacy and authority are important. We all need to know who to trust and who to distrust. But I do not think that the terms science and religion are adequate to be used as shorthands in this manner for just the trustworthy people, right, or the untrustworthy people. Now, perhaps it's unsurprising that as a theologian, I might be the first to make this kind of argument because it's largely through our own fault. It's religion that's got rather the raw end of this deal in recent decades and centuries, a word that is widely associated in the general public with pointless disagreements, pointless violence, closed-mindedness, etc., etc. In fact, last year came up in a class discussion with my students what the opposite of religion is. And the first answer I got, we did have a discussion, but the first answer I got wasn't science, it wasn't secularism, it wasn't atheism. The first answer I got as the opposite of religion was spirituality and open-mindedness. But as Gijsbert has said, and as Josh has written on, perhaps the sciences will increasingly be in a similar position and may want to join forces in order to combat these sorts of worries. The important question I think we need to keep asking is, are these concepts, these words, useful to us? If so, what are they useful for? And who are they useful to? It's worth bearing in mind that any new categories that we come up with, any words to replace science and religion, we will also have to ask, are those categories useful? If so, what for and to whom? So, for example, some have recently suggested that we should revert to natural philosophy as a term to use in our public institutions and our job titles. And so we would ask, if we reverted to natural philosophy, who is that for and what's its use? And I largely imagine this label would be useful for theologically inclined academics who want to feel more important and don't like narrowing themselves to one specialism. And again, this is getting rather personal. But I honestly don't think natural philosophy would be useful for just about anybody else. So the problem with the terms science and religion, everyone agrees, is not just that they're constructed, but it's how they've been constructed, right? Particularly in the English language and through Anglo-American history. Put another way, the problem is what is smuggled into the terms that we don't see, but is there and frames our discussion. Maybe many of us would agree with that stuff's smuggled in and that's where the problem lies, but what exactly is it that's been smuggled? We might have to talk rather longer about that. The most common answer to this question is that conflict is smuggled in. We cannot think religion without thinking not science, and we can't think science without thinking not religion. Actually, I think that whilst conflict, that's true, conflict is smuggled in, I don't think that's really the heart of the matter. I don't think that's the biggest challenge. I think the biggest problem with these words is that they stand as individuated from one another. So not just in opposition to one another, but really clearly demarcated. Something closer to an independence problem, if we use Barber's categories, rather than a conflict problem. The idea that one has ever or could ever exist without the other, I think, is the problem. That progress in one is not in some sense dependent upon or bound up with what happens in the other. So more controversially, I think it is what we call methodological naturalism rather than the metaphysical, atheistic, materialistic thing. That is a more pernicious problem for our collaborative enterprise. We don't have a neat term for the opposite of methodological naturalism on the religious side, right? We don't talk about methodological supernaturalism. It doesn't really work. But we all can recognize that there is the disposition in some communities that we can do our theology and our religious faith and our spiritual lives without any interaction with what we call the natural or psychological sciences, without really having to learn how God's creation works. So now we could ask, who is this independence of science and religion? Who is that useful for? If that's what's smuggled in, who's that useful for? Well, independence is a necessary prior condition for the possibility of conflict, so it's useful for people who are invested in a conflict narrative. It's also, whether that be because they dislike religion and they want it to disappear, or because they want to insulate their religious community from like the world or whatever is out there. But who's the demarcation unhelpful for? So obviously it's unhelpful for theists, particularly those who work in faculties of natural science, departments of medicine, or in practical technology, engineering, business world kind of private enterprises. It's also unhelpful for people like me, for science-engaged theologians who are interested in interdisciplinary collaboration. Perhaps more interestingly yet, I think this demarcation between science and religion is also pretty unhelpful for the majority world, who, even if they're not traditional monotheists or science-engaged theologians, are unlikely to share the very strange and provincial Western view that we call naturalism. And so this brings me to a different kind of objection against the concepts of science and religion, which is not just that they have inbuilt narratives of conflict and independence, but that they are concepts that were forged in the furnace of colonialism and continue to maintain colonialist thinking and epistemologies today. This is perhaps the reason that you may have been surprised earlier to hear me mention Chinese medicine as a science. As has already been mentioned, there are very strong ongoing debates in some places of the world, such as Aotearoa, New Zealand, around whether Maturanga Maori, the indigenous knowledge practices, should be put into natural science departments in universities. As I noted earlier, what post-colonialism may demand of us, actually, I probably didn't know that earlier. That's probably a typo. So what post-colonialism may then demand of us is to give up on independence of scientific inquiry from spiritual beliefs and practices. That is, post-colonialism may force us to relinquish methodological naturalism. Even less discussed is colonialism's older sibling, classism. And I think the idea of community science, which moves the focus of energy of scientific practice out of the ivory tower of laboratories into local communities, is a newer major challenge to the classism of what counts as science. The questioning of whether community science is real science shows again that we have strong reactions that I think are based in classist assumptions. So the question we're facing, I think, in this discussion is not, are the terms science and religion essentialist terms? We're all here because we agree they're surely not, and that need not necessarily be a problem. But are they useful? And if so, who are they useful to? That is the question we need to discuss, and it is a political question, actually, and an ethical question. A question of who defines the legitimacy of our intellectual inquiry, legitimate ways to express and meet human spiritual needs. It's a question of how far are we willing to stretch and revise these norms of our discourse, and indeed the shape and diversity of our institutions, in order to keep these terms alive, but stretch them to make them ethically adequate. And whether we're willing to do that kind of work will depend, again, on who we think science is for, who we think religion is for, and who we think the field of science and religion is for. So, as you can tell, I'm pretty sympathetic to the idea that we definitely need to revise the terms, but I'm skeptical we'll be able to do so adequately. So I'm open to the idea that we could jettison them. But I have no bright ideas for what might replace them. Sorry, that would have been great, wouldn't it? If William Weyhall was still alive today, he's the guy who came up with the term scientist and a few other key terms that we use today, maybe he could help us out, have some bright ideas. But until his successor appears to us, I think the best we can do is keep asking, who are these concepts really serving? And is that the best that we can do?